Hello and welcome to today's session. So, we are looking at this essay, The Poetic Principle by Edgar Allan Poe, the American poet and critic. After having spoken about the heresy of didactism, which we have taken a look at in the previous session, he goes on to talk about the distinctions between poetry and truth. He tries to differentiate between the elements of poetry and the elements of truth. And this is in stark contrast with also the prevalent belief that poetry and truth are similar in certain ways. And here we also find him moving away from the romantic impulses that were predominant in England from the British poets, where they also believed that poetry is truth, that poetry is perhaps the best expression of beauty as well as truth. And we also find this equation getting very pronouncedly articulated in most of the poems of the romantic writers of that period in England. So, this departure is very significant, particularly in the critical articulations of Edgar Allan Poe, where he tries to tread the same line as the romantics in terms of some of his principles, but he also tries to move away from some of the cardinal elements, particularly as we will now shortly see in the differentiation between poetry and truth. With as deep a reverence for the truth as ever inspired the bosom of man, I would nevertheless limit in some measure its modes of inculcation. I would limit to enforce them. I would not enfeeble them by dissipation. The demands of truth are severe. So, this is the way in which he begins to differentiate one from the other. The demands of truth are severe. All that which is so indispensable in song is precisely all that which she has nothing whatever to do. So, if song is something which is a significant attribute of poetry, then truth has got nothing to do with it. It is but making her a flaunting paradox to wreath her in gems and flowers. In enforcing a truth, we need severity rather than the efflorescence of language. So, it is something which cannot be captured within poetic language. Truth is something which demands severity, gravity of expression. We must be simple, precise, terse. We must be cool, calm, unimpassioned. In a word, we must be in that mode which, as nearly as possible, is the exact converse of the poetical. Here, truth is seen as something which is antithetical to poetry. The impulses which govern both these elements are seen as entirely different. He must be blind indeed who does not perceive the radical and casement differences between the truthful and the poetical modes of inculcation. He must be theory mad beyond redemption, who, in spite of these differences, shall still persist in attempting to reconcile the obstinate oils and waters of poetry and truth. Poetry and truth are seen as separate as chalk and cheese, as separate as oil and water. They cannot be reconciled together at all. Here I also want you to recall what Sidney had articulated in his defense of poetry, where he defended the poet against the allegation that poetry was also the nurse of all abuses, nurse of all lies. So, he pursued this argument that the poet in the first place never claimed to say the truth, so he cannot logically lie either. So, here we find this argument being articulated in entirely different form by saying that truth and poetry are two different impulses which have two different demands upon language. So, it cannot coexist. They are as separate as oil and water. If you try to bring them together, it will be like trying to bring in two very obstinate things which cannot be yoked together at all. Now, Poe gets into some kind of philosophizing over here, where he talks about the need to divide the mind into three in order to understand how this works. He divides the mind into three: the pure intellect, taste and moral sense. And there's a hierarchy. There's a sense of hierarchy that he begins to identify, a certain kind of combination permutations which he thinks would be possible within this framework. I place taste in the middle because it is just this position which in mind it occupies. It holds intimate relations with either extreme. But from the moral sense, it's separated by so faint a difference that Aristotle has not hesitated to place some of its operations among the virtues themselves. Nevertheless, we find the offices of the trio marked with a sufficient distinction, just as the intellect concerns itself with the truth. So, taste informs us of the beautiful, while moral sense is regardful of duty. So, here is taste placed in the middle. So, it can tilt towards intellect or towards moral sense. You can't have both at the same time, he is trying to say. So, Intellect concerns itself with truth. Taste informs us of the beautiful, and the moral sense is regardful of duty. So he says that while conscience teaches the obligation, reason the expediency, taste contents herself with displaying the charms, waging war upon vice solely on the ground of her deformity, her disproportion, her animosity to the fitting, to the appropriate, to the harmonious, in a word, to beauty. So we find this peculiar kind of positioning that Poe also talks about, where in the mind taste occupies the center stage and it could move towards the intellect or towards the moral sense, and these two are almost diametrically opposite. These two cannot come together, as he talks about truth and beauty in the previous sense. In the next passage, he is trying to link the impulse of poetry towards immortality. An immortal instinct deep within the spirit of man is thus plainly a sense of the beautiful. So there is an instinct to move towards the beautiful, and that is the poetic impulse, and that is perhaps the instinctive impulse within man to move towards immortality. And this is how he situates poetry over here. As he reiterates, we have still a thirst unquenchable to allay which he has not shown as a crystal spring. This thirst belongs to the immortality of man. It's at once a consequence and an indication of his perennial existence. It is the desire of the moth for the star. It's no mere appreciation of the beauty before us, but a wild effort to reach the beauty above. So this is how poetry gets elevated to a divine status over here. Poetry is that which allows man to be immortal, and by extension art is that which allows man to be immortal. So we find this even in the poetry and in the writings of the romantics of the British Isle as well. So we do find that when, for instance, when the Grecian urn is being talked about poetically, it's also about accessing immortality. It's about a thing of the past which has almost been recreated in the present. So poetry here becomes something which makes immortality possible. It's about the art which lives beyond the artist, which lives beyond its creator, thereby achieving a status of vicariously achieving a status of immortality. He's further separating the idea of duty or truth from the poetic impulses when he says, to recapitulate then, I would define in brief the poetry of words as a rhythmical creation of beauty. Its sole arbiter is taste. It's entirely dependent on the taste, it's entirely dependent on instinct and common sense, as he had reiterated right at the outset of this essay. With the intellect or with the conscience, it has only collateral relations. Unless incidentally, it has no connection whatever either with duty or with truth. So it's a very unapologetic statement which states very clearly that poetry has got nothing to do with duty or truth. There's no purpose, there's no aim, there is no larger moral objective which is beyond the poem itself. So poetry is it is an end by itself, and its ultimate aim is to produce beauty, to celebrate beauty, and its sole arbiter is also taste, not intellect, not reason, not any kind of moral conditioning. And this kind of pleasure which one derives by appreciating the beautiful, he says that is perhaps the ultimate kind of pleasure, and that is the kind of pleasure that poetry affords too. And he goes on to give a series of poems where he feels he can personally, very subjectively experience this kind of pleasure. The first one is a poem by Longfellow, and Longfellow is one of the leading American poets of those times, and Longfellow and Poe had a very problematic relationship with each other. They used to be very cynical and critical about each other's poetry, but here he uses this work from Longfellow to show how this kind of work affords the ultimate kind of poetic pleasure. With no great range of imagination, these lines have been justly admired for their delicacy of expression. Some of the images are very effective. You can also find that he's very cynical even when he's admiring a certain piece of work, which we can find in most of Poe's writings, where his compliments are not always direct, just like he's suspicious about even some of the traditional forms of poetry like epic, which this essay also begins with. We find that his appreciation is always a cynical kind. He's very suspicious about the kind of talents the other poets of his time possessed. And when he is giving us another example, this is how he talks about this work. The poem has always affected me in a remarkable manner. It's also a very subjective thing. The taste over here is very, very subjective. It's about a certain personal kind of transformation which happens inside the poet. It's not technical. It's not something which is related to anything universal such as duty or truth or some larger objective that that particular piece of poetry has. It's a very subjective thing which can be only experienced. The intense melancholy which seems to well up perforce to the surface of all the poet's cheerful sayings about his grave, we find thrilling us to the soul. So, while there is the truest poetic elevation in the thrill, the impression left is one of a pleasurable sadness. So, here I also wanted to recall some of the impressions made by Longinus, where he spoke about the power of poetry to elevate, to transport the reader out of oneself. So, that's again a personal experience that cannot be an experience which could be acquired through any kind of technical perfection. That's about that's about stirring the soul. So, it's a very subjective romantic kind of an experience which Longinus had articulated way back during the classical times, which is why perhaps he had to be renovated, which is why perhaps his works had to resurface, and it got the kind of recognition that it deserved only during the romantic period. And rightfully Scott James had referred to him as the first romantic critic. Poe continues to talk about a number of poems which he found exciting at a personal level, which he found very moving in a very subjective sense. So, this includes a lot of well-known as well as less known poems. It also includes some of those poems which he refers to as minor poems. For instance, here he talks about one of the minor poems of Lord Byron, one which has never received from the critics the praise which it undoubtedly deserves. So, he also moves out of the critical framework, out of the canonical framework, to look at certain subjective experiences which he renders as more powerful, as more elevated, as more valid than that of the critical opinion of those times. In fact, there are a lot of instances where he quotes certain critics and he says he does not value that kind of an opinion. On the other hand, he finds his personal subjective experience and the evaluation based on that more valid. And one of the beautiful instances where he talks about another contemporary poet, Alfred Tennyson, it's worth citing over here. He says, from Alfred Tennyson, although in perfect sincerity, I regard him as the noblest poet that ever lived. I have left myself time to cite only a very brief specimen. I call him and think him the noblest of poets, not because the impressions he produces are at all times the most profound, not because the poetical excitement which he induces is at all times the most intense, but because it is at all times the most ethereal. Again, we find something very similar to that of Longinus, the idea of the sublime. In other words, the most elevating and the most pure. No poet is so little of the earthy. So, and he also reads out from one of his last long poems, The Princess. So, here we also find another a very interesting thing. Alfred Tennyson is someone who could be considered as a poet who is positioned at this transition stage. He was a Victorian poet when you look at the chronology, the periodization of British history, but we find that here he is being referred to as a contemporary romantic poet. So, there are these overlaps that we would find in these articulations, and interestingly Tennyson is also seen as a modern poet, a modernist poet, especially his latter poems. So, coming back to this discussion, Poe is about to wrap up his observations, and he says, although in a very cursory and imperfect manner, I have endeavoured to convey to you my conception of the poetic principle. It has been my purpose to suggest that while this principle itself is strictly and simply the human aspiration for supernal beauty, the manifestation of the principle is always found in an elevating excitement of the soul. So, this is what he ultimately focuses upon. If the poetry that you're reading, if it does not have the capacity to give to produce an experience of an elevating excitement, then perhaps it is not good poetry at all. So, his yardsticks are not technical in that sense. It's more subjective. It's more experience based. That's what makes him again a true romantic poet as well. And he also talks about a conception of what true poetry is, and it's a very romantic rhetoric over here that he reiterates. By mere reference to a few of the simple elements which induce in the poet himself the true poetical effect. And as we have already seen, it's very difficult to define what these true poetical effects are, what this experience of elevation is, and it is left at a very subjective experiential level throughout this work. And he talks about how this could be seen in different things. Some of the examples being he recognizes the ambrosia and then he perceives it in the songs of birds, in the harp of Aeolus, in the sighing of the night wind, in the repining voice of the forest, and the surf that complains to the shore. So the list is quite endless, and it also talks about how it could be felt in the beauty of woman, in the grace of her step, in the luster of her eye, in the melody of her voice, in her soft laughter, in her sigh, in the harmony of the rustling of her robes. Yeah, so this is how he talks about, this is how in very subjective experiential terms he talks about the experience of poetic elevation, the experience of good poetry, fine poetry that leaves behind a sensuous sensation which cannot be captured by any kind of technical details. So he concludes by quoting from another poem. Then he says, with our modern and altogether rational ideas of the absurdity and impiety of warfare, we are not precisely in that frame of mind best adapted to sympathize with the sentiments and thus to appreciate the real excellence of the poem. To do this fully, we must identify ourselves in fancy with the soul of the old cavalier. It also talks about how different poems lend themselves to different kind of readings at different times. So it's also about the context which produces certain kinds of reading, which compels you to read particular works in particular ways. And this is what perhaps the revolution of the of that century also had done to the readings and to the writings of those times. So Poe is also trying to tell us that this experience, though even when it is being very subjective, maybe it's also rooted in those multiple things which lie outside the self, which lie outside the work of art, outside the work of poetry. So it's also about how particular kinds of circumstances induce certain kinds of experiences or help you to experience certain emotions in a better way, or in a rather in a different way altogether. So with this we come to the end of this discussion. I hope you've been able to see how Edgar Allan Poe, he showcases a different kind of romanticism which is very subjective in nature, and which also talks about tradition in radically new ways by detaching himself from some of the conventional ideas which dominate the understanding of poetry. But it nevertheless it talks about the ways in which personal engagement could perhaps give a better understanding, a better appreciation of what poetry is. I thank you for your time and your attention, and I look forward to seeing you in the next session.